The chair scraped against the plank floor of the Dusty Creek Saloon dining room so hard that every head in the place turned. Ida Hawthorne sat frozen, her spine rigid as iron, her hands pressed flat against the rough-hewn table where she had eaten alone every single evening for the past 4 months. Alone while the married women of Dusty Creek, Texas, whispered behind their fans. Alone while the ranchers and their wives occupied every other table in tight, comfortable clusters. Alone while the widow Beale shot looks of theatrical pity across the room, and the younger girls giggled without bothering to lower their voices. Alone, always alone, because the rumor that had arrived in this town 3 days before Ida herself had preceded her like a dark shadow, soaking into the soil of Dusty Creek before she'd even set her trunk down at the boarding house. The rumor said she was guilty. The rumor said she had burned down the general store in Red Hollow, that she had taken the money from the till and left her employer, a man named Frank Calloway, for dead in the smoke and ash. The rumor said Ida Hawthorne was dangerous, that she was a thief, that she was a liar, and that any decent person who valued their standing in this community would be wise to keep their distance. So they had every supper. Every single supper for 4 months. And then tonight, on a Thursday evening in September of 1882, with the oil lamps throwing amber light across the dining room of the Dusty Creek Saloon, where Mrs. Prentice cooked the only affordable hot meal in town, the door opened. Boots struck the floorboards with authority. And Sheriff Peter Graves walked in, still wearing his badge and his long duster coat with the trail dust barely shaken from the shoulders, and he crossed the room in 8 deliberate strides, and he looked directly at Ida Hawthorne, and without a single word, without asking permission, without the slightest hesitation, he pulled out the empty chair beside her and sat down. The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear the grease popping in Mrs. Prentice's kitchen. Ida did not move. She did not breathe. She stared at the bowl of beef stew in front of her as though it held the answers to every question she had been carrying since the night her life had burned down along with Frank Calloway's store, and she told herself, fiercely and silently, that she would not cry. She would not give this town the satisfaction. And she absolutely would not look at the man who had just done the bravest, most confounding, most terrifying thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. But her hands were shaking under the table. And Sheriff Peter Graves, without looking at her, simply picked up the fork that Mrs. Prentice had already set out for the next customer and said, in a voice low enough to be private and steady enough to be granite, "Evening, Miss Hawthorne. I hear the stew is decent tonight." She had been in Dusty Creek for exactly 123 days when he sat down beside her. But the story of how she came to be sitting alone in the first place began long before that, in the dying town of Red Hollow, Kansas, on a night when the sky turned orange, and Ida Hawthorne discovered that the secrets of other people had a way of burning innocent lives to the ground. Red Hollow in the spring of 1882 was not much to look at. It had 2 streets, a church, a blacksmith, a post office, and Calloway's general store, which was the beating commercial heart of the community and the place where Ida had worked as a ledger keeper and shop assistant for 2 years. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died of fever when she was 19, and a mother who had followed him into the churchyard 2 years later, leaving Ida with nothing but a solid education, a practical nature, and the kind of quiet self-reliance that people sometimes mistook for coldness. She had not been cold. She had simply learned early that depending on others was a luxury she could not afford. Frank Calloway had been, on the surface, a respectable businessman. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with a ready smile, and the manner of a man the whole town trusted. He paid Ida fairly, which was more than most employers did for a woman doing the same work a man would have done. She had been grateful for that, and she had repaid his trust by keeping meticulous records, catching errors, and running his accounts with a precision that had saved the store considerable money over the years. What Ida had not known, in those 2 years of honest labor, was that Frank Calloway was systematically defrauding the 5 ranchers who supplied him with goods on credit, recording their deliveries at a fraction of their true value and pocketing the difference. She had not known because Calloway kept 2 sets of ledgers, the clean one she managed, and the true one he kept hidden beneath the floorboards of his private office. She discovered it by accident on a Tuesday evening in March, when she had returned to the store after hours because she had forgotten her shawl. The store was dark except for a lamp in Calloway's office, and when she moved to retrieve her shawl from the hook near the back, she heard him talking, not to himself, to someone she recognized with a jolt of cold recognition as Hector Mays, the county tax assessor. The nature of their conversation made her stand perfectly still in the darkness, her shawl clutched in both hands, her heart hammering so loud she was certain they would hear it through the wall. Calloway was not merely cheating the ranchers. He was also falsifying the tax records that Mays submitted to the county seat, and the 2 men were splitting the savings between them. The scheme had been running for 3 years. The amounts involved were staggering for a small town, thousands of dollars misappropriated and redirected into private pockets, while the ranchers who trusted Calloway with their livelihoods absorbed losses they couldn't explain. Ida slipped out of the store without being seen. She spent 3 sleepless nights deciding what to do. She was a woman alone with no family, no legal standing, and no resources. Going to the local law meant going to Deputy Carl Finch, who drank with Calloway every Friday and whose wife bought all her household goods from the store on extended credit. Going to the county sheriff seemed like a better option, but Hector Mays was the man who sat beside the county sheriff at church, and the county sheriff was known to share a hunting cabin with the tax assessor every autumn. The corruption ran deeper than one store in one small town. On the 4th night, Ida made her decision. She would copy the relevant figures from the clean ledger she managed, the one that showed the real delivery quantities before Calloway adjusted them, cross-reference them with the purchase orders she had access to, and send the evidence to the State Revenue Office in Topeka. It was the only authority she could think of that operated outside the local network of mutual protection. She spent 2 evenings making careful, accurate copies. On the 3rd evening, she returned to the store after dark to retrieve the documents she had left in the bottom of her desk drawer, meaning to finalize everything before posting it the following morning. She found the store already on fire. The back office was completely engulfed by the time she pushed through the front door, the heat hitting her like a physical wall. She screamed for Calloway, who sometimes slept in the back room during busy seasons, and heard a groan from somewhere inside the thickening smoke. She went in after him, found him unconscious on the floor, and dragged him out onto the dirt street with a strength she hadn't known she possessed, fueled entirely by terror and the absolute refusal to let another human being die if she could prevent it. The town woke up around the orange glow. People came running. Buckets materialized. Ida stood on the street, coughing, her dress singed at the hem, her arms shaking from the effort of dragging a man twice her size. And then Hector Mays appeared from somewhere in the crowd, took one long look at Ida, and said in a voice designed to carry, "Someone find out what she was doing in that store at this hour." The accusation was swift, efficient, and devastating. By morning, the story that Dusty Creek would eventually receive was already forming in Red Hollow. Ida Hawthorne had been caught stealing from the till, had set the fire to cover her crime, and had nearly killed her employer in the process. The fact that she had actually dragged Calloway to safety was reframed as a desperate performance of innocence. The fact that Calloway himself, when he regained consciousness, did not immediately contradict the story was because Hector Mays had been there first, alone in that recovery room before any other witness arrived. Calloway, it turned out, feared Mays more than he feared God. Ida had no evidence. Her copies had been inside her desk drawer, which was ash. The original fraudulent ledger, if it had ever been discoverable, was certainly gone now. Whether burned by accident or by design, she would never know. She had her word, and her word, in a town where May's held influence and Calloway's recovering condition made him a sympathetic figure, meant very little. She left Red Hollow before they could formally charge her, which might have been the one mistake she ever truly made, though she did not see another option at the time. She packed what she could carry, withdrew the small savings she kept at the bank before the story fully hardened into official accusation, and bought passage on the southbound stage. She landed in Dusty Creek, Texas, with $32, 2 trunks, a letter of reference she had written herself because she had no one left to write one for her, and a reputation that had ridden ahead of her on the telegraph wire. Dusty Creek was the kind of town that needed workers more than it needed caution. Ida found a room at Mrs. Aldrin's boarding house on the strength of a week's rent paid in advance, and she found work 3 days later at the town's dry goods store, owned by a cautious but not unkind man named George Hawes, who needed someone to manage his accounts, and who either had not heard the Red Hollow story yet, or had decided her bookkeeping skills outweighed the gossip. She did her work with the same precision and honesty she always had. She ate her supper alone. She did not complain, or beg, or attempt to force her way into the social fabric of a town that had already decided who she was. She had her pride, and she had her innocence, and she had learned by now that neither of those things was worth much in the social currency of a small Western community. She waited. For what? She was not entirely sure. Peter Graves had been the sheriff of Dusty Creek for 4 years, appointed by the county after the previous sheriff had retired to his daughter's farm in Austin. He was 32 years old, 6 feet tall, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that had the particular quality of a man who had learned to see past the surface of things. He had grown up in Missouri, studied law for 1 underfunded year at a university in St. Louis before money ran out, and drifted west through a series of occupations, deputy work in 2 other counties, some time as a cattle hand, and a brief and regrettable period as a bounty hunter that he did not discuss with anyone, before taking the Dusty Creek position. He was the kind of man who was considered unmarriageable by the matchmaking contingent of the town, not because anything was wrong with him, but because nothing about him could be easily categorized or controlled. He was polite without being warm, fair without being soft, and capable of a silence that people found either comfortable or unnerving, depending on their conscience. He had heard about Ida Hawthorne the same day she arrived, as was inevitable in a town of 800 people. He had listened to what the widow Beale told him at the post office, and then he had gone back to his office and written a letter to the sheriff's office in Red Hollow, Kansas, asking for the official report on the fire and any associated charges. The reply came 6 weeks later. There were no formal charges filed against Ida Hawthorne in Red Hollow. The investigation into the fire had been brief, the cause ruled accidental, and no criminal case had been opened. The gossip about theft, it turned out, had never been substantiated enough to reach the level of an actual warrant. This interested Peter enormously, because it meant that what had followed Ida Hawthorne south into Texas was not legal fact. It was rumor, and the people of Dusty Creek had arranged their social cruelty around a rumor that had no legal foundation whatsoever. He did not act immediately. He was a careful man by nature, and he wanted to know more before he made a move that could not be unmade in a town where appearance and reputation were the primary currency of social order. He made quiet inquiries. He spoke to George Hawes, who told him that Ida kept the most precise set of accounts he had ever seen, and that in 3 months she had caught 2 errors in his inventory worth more than her monthly wages combined. He spoke to Mrs. Aldrin, who said Ida paid on time, kept her room tidy, did not entertain visitors, and had never once caused a moment of trouble. He watched her at supper from across the room on 2 evenings without her knowledge, and what he saw was a woman sitting alone with a dignity that shamed every person in that room who chose not to see it. He thought about it for another week, and then on a Thursday evening in September, he walked into Mrs. Prentice's dining room, crossed the floor, and pulled out the chair beside Ida Hawthorne. Ida sat beside him in a silence that stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably 30 seconds, during which the rest of the dining room went through a remarkable communal recalibration. The widow Beale's expression traveled from shock to calculation in the time it took to draw a breath. The rancher Tom Dillard and his wife exchanged a look of visible discomfort. Mrs. Prentice appeared in the kitchen doorway, assessed the situation with the practiced eye of a woman who had managed a public dining room for 12 years, and disappeared back into her kitchen without comment. "Sheriff," Ida said finally, her voice flat and carefully controlled, "may I ask what you think you're doing?" "Having supper," Peter said. "There are other seats." "There are," he agreed. "This one was empty." She turned then slowly and looked at him directly for the first time, and the look on her face was not gratitude. It was suspicion, sharp and entirely reasonable, the expression of a woman who had been burned badly enough to view every unexpected kindness as a potential trap. "What do you want?" she said very quietly so that only he could hear. He met her gaze without flinching. "Nothing from you," he said, which was honest. "I want something from this room." He did not elaborate further, and she did not ask him to because she understood, with a comprehension that was both sharp and painful, exactly what he meant. He was making a statement, and the statement was being heard by every person in that dining room who had chosen, for 4 months, to let a woman sit alone rather than risk their own social comfort. Mrs. Prentice brought him stew without being asked. They ate in silence for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence, which was the first thing that surprised Ida. She had expected awkwardness, or the particular strained politeness of two people performing civility for an audience. Instead, the silence between them was simply quiet, like a field after rain, and she found, to her considerable annoyance, that she did not feel the need to fill it. After a time, Peter said, "You're from Kansas." "Red Hollow," she said, because denying it served no purpose. "I know," he said. Another silence. "I wrote to the sheriff's office there," he said. "There are no charges against you, no warrant, no official record of any theft or arson attributed to your name." Ida set her spoon down with a precision that suggested she was working very hard to keep her hand steady. She had not known that. She had left Red Hollow assuming the worst, assuming that the machinery of official accusation had been set in motion, and the discovery that it had not been, that what she had been running from was pure rumor and nothing more, hit her with a complicated mixture of relief and fury that she had to press down very hard to keep from her face. "I didn't steal anything," she said. "I know," he said again. "I didn't set that fire. I know." She looked at him, and the look was measuring and slightly incredulous. "You don't know anything about me," she said, not combatively but plainly. "You read a letter from a sheriff's office that said there were no charges. That doesn't tell you what happened. It doesn't tell you who I am." "No," he said, "but George Hawes does, and Mrs. Aldrin does, and I've been watching you for 2 weeks, Miss Hawthorne, long enough to form my own opinion." Ida absorbed this information. "You've been watching me." "Professionally," he said without apology. "It's my job to know what's happening in this town. What's happening in this town is that a woman is being treated as guilty of crimes that don't exist on paper, and that's the kind of injustice I don't particularly care to ignore." She was quiet for a long moment. The dining room had gradually resumed its background noise of conversation and silverware, though she could feel the awareness of the room directed their way, people talking among themselves while listening with everything they had. "You may have made things worse," she said carefully. "I may have," he admitted, "but I don't think so. People in this town respect the law more than they respect gossip as a general rule. Some of them will revise their opinions now. Some of them won't, but at least it's honest. And if my reputation damages yours—" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the gray of his eyes in the lamplight was steady and entirely unconcerned. "I'm willing to take that risk," he said. Ida Hawthorne, who had not cried since the night she stood in the dirt street of Red Hollow watching everything she had built turn to ash, felt something crack, very small and very deep, somewhere behind her ribs. She did not cry. She picked up her spoon and finished her stew, but she said before she left the table that night in a voice too quiet for anyone else to hear, "Thank you, Sheriff Graves." And he said, "Peter." "And you're welcome, Ida." She walked back to the boarding house in the warm September evening with the first real breath of air she had taken in 4 months, and she stood on the porch in the dark for a long time, looking at the stars above the flat Texas plain, and let herself feel it. The relief, and the fragile, terrifying possibility that something might be different now. The following Sunday, Mrs. Tom Dillard nodded to her at the church entrance. It was a small thing. It was enormous. The widow Beale, who was a cannily political woman at heart, spent 3 days assessing the implications of the sheriff's public vote of confidence in Ida Hawthorne before arriving at Mrs. Aldrin's boarding house with a tin of biscuits and the studied warmth of a woman who had decided that being on the wrong side of any situation was beneath her dignity. Ida received the biscuits with a courtesy she did not necessarily feel, and the widow Beale sat in the parlor for 45 minutes and talked herself into a somewhat revised narrative in which she had never really believed the worst of Ida. She had simply been cautious, as anyone sensible would be. Ida let her have it. The truth of what had happened between them would keep. She had larger things to tend to. The most immediate of those larger things was that George Hawes came to her a week after the supper, looking uncomfortable, and told her that he had received a visit from a man passing through town who had introduced himself as a cousin of Frank Calloway's, and who had made certain pointed inquiries about Ida's whereabouts and current employment. He had told the man nothing beyond the fact that, yes, a woman by that name worked at his store, which he was apologizing for now because he could see by Ida's face that the information was unwelcome. Ida thanked him calmly and went directly to the sheriff's office. Peter was at his desk when she walked in, and he looked up from the report he was reading with an expression that shifted from neutral professionalism to something more attentive when he registered her face. "Sit down," he said immediately. She sat. She told him everything, not just about the cousin, but about all of it, the whole story of Red Hollow, the fraudulent ledgers, Hector Mays and Frank Calloway, the fire, the copies she had lost, the decision to run before charges could be officially leveled against her. She told it in order and without embellishment, the way she had always kept her accounts, precisely, honestly, without leaving anything out. Peter listened without interrupting. He leaned forward in his chair with his forearms on the desk and his attention completely focused, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The man who visited Hawes," he said. "Did Hawes describe him? Tall, dark suit. He introduced himself as Vane Calloway." Peter wrote the name down. "You said Frank Calloway's store was the financial heart of Red Hollow." It was. If the fraudulent ledger burned with the store, Calloway lost his own evidence of wrongdoing. "So why would he send someone after you?" Ida had thought about this. "Because I knew," she said. "Even without the physical evidence, I could testify to what I overheard. I could tell the State Revenue Office what I know, and even without documents, an investigation of that nature tends to turn things up that people would rather stay buried. Mays is still the county tax assessor. The financial records he's been falsifying would be in the county archive, not the store." Peter looked at her with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite surprise, but was somewhere near both. "You've been thinking about this." "I've had 4 months of supper alone," she said. "I've had time." A quiet moment passed between them, and then Peter said, with the flat directness that was, she was beginning to understand, simply his natural way of speaking, "I'm going to look into this. And in the meantime, I want you to be careful. Don't walk alone after dark. Let me know if this Vane Calloway or anyone else approaches you directly." "I don't need a keeper," she said, not unkindly. "No," he agreed. "But you might need a sheriff. There's a difference." She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she had managed in 4 months, and it surprised her enough that she pressed her lips together to stop it. "All right," she said. "A sheriff, thank you." She walked back to Haw's dry goods store in the morning light, and she was aware, for the first time, of the town around her differently, not as a hostile landscape, but as a place with dimensions, textures, the smell of feed grain from the livery stable, the distant sound of hammering from the new building going up on the east end of Main Street, the way the autumn light fell long and gold across the dust of the road. She was aware of existing in it rather than simply enduring it. Which was dangerous, she told herself firmly. Getting comfortable was dangerous. Getting attached to places was dangerous. She had a history that proved it. But the light was gold, and it fell warmly across her face, and she let it. Peter wrote to the Kansas State Revenue Office in Topeka that same afternoon. He wrote under his official letterhead, which was modest but genuine, identifying himself as sheriff of Dusty Creek County, Texas, and laying out the information Ida had given him in clear, factual, legally precise language. He noted that he had no physical evidence to present at this stage, but that he had a credible witness with direct knowledge of the scheme who was willing, if contacted through his office, to provide a full account. He requested that the office investigate the county tax records of Red Hollow's district for the years 1879 through 1882. He sent the letter on the Tuesday stage. Then he made inquiries about Vane Calloway. What he turned up, through the network of sheriff's offices and federal marshals that maintained a loose but functional communication across the Western Territories, was not reassuring. Vane Calloway was not in fact Frank Calloway's cousin. He was a man for hire who operated under several different names, and who had a history in Missouri and Kansas of performing the kind of work that wealthy, frightened men needed performed when the official law could not be trusted to do it for them. He had never been convicted of anything, which was perhaps more alarming than a criminal record, because it suggested a man skilled enough at his work to leave no traceable damage. Peter kept this information to himself for a day. Then he decided that keeping it from Ida served no legitimate purpose, and a number of bad ones, chief among them the fact that she deserved to know the nature of her situation. He was not in the business of protecting adults from their own circumstances by withholding truth. He stopped at Haw's store on a Wednesday afternoon. Ida was behind the counter entering figures in the ledger when he came in. She looked up, registered his expression, and said, with a calm that he had come to recognize as the particular discipline of a woman who did not allow herself the luxury of visible panic, "Tell me," he told her. She listened without changing her expression very much. When he finished, she set her pen down precisely across the spine of the ledger and was quiet for a moment. "He's not here to hurt me," she said finally, working through it. "He's here to find me and report back. Or perhaps to find a way to discredit me further, to make sure anything I might say to an official inquiry looks unreliable before the inquiry begins." "That's my read," Peter said. "So they know I'm alive and in Dusty Creek. They knew that after Vane Calloway spoke to Hawes. Then there's no point in running again," she said, and the words were flat and definitive in a way that told him the decision cost her more than her voice let on. "No," he said, "and I wouldn't recommend it regardless. Running looks like guilt, and you've got nothing to feel guilty about." She looked at him across the counter, and the look had something in it that was different from her usual carefully maintained neutrality, something more direct. "You have a great deal of confidence in my innocence for a man who has known me for approximately 10 days, she said. 11, he said. "I've told you why. George Hawes and Mrs. Aldrin, and my own observation," he said, "which I trust more than most things." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked down at her ledger and picked up her pen, and he understood that the conversation was over, not because she was dismissing him, but because she needed to end it before the feeling behind it became visible, and that restraint was something he recognized because it was his own. "I'll be careful," she said. "Thank you, Peter." He left the store with the sound of his name and her voice following him out into the street, and he stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the autumn afternoon, Aware that he was in a situation that required a degree of professional detachment, he was finding increasingly difficult to maintain, and that the difficulty was not unwelcome to him, which was its own kind of problem. October arrived and changed the quality of the light, making the evenings come earlier and the mornings crisper. The pecan trees along the creek at the edge of town turned yellow-brown, and the cattle drives that had been pushing north all summer slowed and thinned as the season turned toward its close. Dusty Creek settled into the quieter rhythm of autumn, and Ida settled with it, not comfortably exactly, but functionally, learning the town the way you learn a language by necessity rather than affection. She had supper at Mrs. Prentice's dining room every evening. Peter sat beside her on Tuesdays and Thursdays. On the other evenings she was alone, but it was a different kind of alone now, the alone of a woman at a table that people looked at with consideration rather than contempt. The widow Beale, having committed to her revised position, actually sat with her on a Friday evening and talked for an hour about nothing of consequence, and Ida, who had spent months being starved for ordinary conversation, found that even the widow Beale's gossip was pleasant when you had been deprived of it long enough. Small mercies, but the Tuesday and Thursday evenings were the ones she thought about. Peter was not a man who said unnecessary things. He did not perform conversation or fill silence for its own sake, which meant that when he spoke, she listened carefully, because it was always worth hearing. He told her things about the town she hadn't known, the history of it, the drought of 1878 that had nearly finished it, the water deal that had saved it, the particular social geology of who owned what land and who had been here longest and who was newly arrived, and what those layers meant for how things worked. He was teaching her the place, she realized, without making it obvious that was what he was doing, and the knowledge was useful to her in practical ways that went beyond mere social understanding. He asked her things too. He asked carefully, respecting the limits she set without making her define them explicitly, which was a skill she had not encountered often. She told him about her father's schoolroom and the education she had received by virtue of growing up inside it. She told him about the 2 years in Red Hollow, not the end of it but the ordinary days, what it had been like to manage accounts and find satisfaction in the precision of it, the pleasure of numbers that balanced and records that were true. She did not tell him yet about the loneliness that had lived at the center of those ordinary days, the particular loneliness of a woman who had always been practical enough to survive and not quite certain how to do anything else. He seemed to understand it anyway. One Tuesday in late October, when the evening had gone cold enough that Mrs. Prentice had lit the fireplace at the end of the room and the dining space felt warmly enclosed, he said without preamble, "A letter came from Topeka today." Ida looked up from her coffee. "The Revenue Office. They've opened an inquiry," he said. "They're sending an investigator to Red Hollow within the month." She absorbed this. The inquiry she had wanted to set in motion from the beginning, the thing she had been unable to do from inside Red Hollow because the local authorities were too compromised, was finally happening. From outside the situation, through an honest letter from a sheriff in another state who had no stake in the outcome, the machinery of proper justice had finally been engaged. She was not prepared for how strongly she felt it. She thought she had walled that feeling off, the desperate need for the truth to be acknowledged, the need for someone to look at the facts and reach the correct conclusion without the distortion of Hector May's influence and Frank Calloway's fear. She had told herself, she had made peace with the possibility that it would never happen, that she would simply live with the injustice and build something new from the outside of it. She had not, apparently, made peace with it at all. Peter watched her face very carefully and did not say anything, which was the correct thing to do. "Thank you," she said when she trusted her voice. "You did the work," he said. "I just held the pen." She looked at him across the small table with the firelight moving over both of them, and something shifted between them, something that had been building in the careful architecture of Tuesday and Thursday evenings. in the space between questions asked and answers given, in the steady accumulation of a man who simply, consistently, showed up and sat beside her. She felt it shift, and she could see by the stillness that came over his face that he felt it too. Neither of them named it. It was too new and too precarious, and they were both people who had learned to be careful about the things they let themselves want. But she did not look away, and neither did he, and the fire crackled warmly at the end of the room, and the evening held them in it for a moment that was entirely apart from everything that had come before. November brought the investigator from Topeka. His name was Clement Walker, and he passed through Dusty Creek on his way north into Kansas, stopping for one night to speak with Ida in Peter's office, with Peter present as a courtesy and a witness. Walker was a precise, unsmiling man of about 50 who wore good boots and asked his questions in the manner of someone who had already done considerable homework. He took down Ida's account in shorthand, asked clarifying questions about dates and amounts and the specific nature of what she had overheard, and showed no visible reaction to any of it, which Ida found oddly reassuring. He was not interested in drama. He was interested in facts. At the end of the interview, he said, "You understand that an inquiry of this type may result in criminal charges against Calloway and Mays. If that happens, you may be called as a witness." "I understand," she said. "It would require returning to Kansas for a period or potentially traveling to Topeka." "I understand," she said again. "And you're willing." "I've been willing since March," she said, with a quiet force that Walker received without expression, though Peter, sitting to one side, allowed the smallest alteration at the corner of his mouth that might, in stronger light, have been a smile. Walker thanked them both, packed his notes, and caught the northbound stage the following morning. November deepened. The temperature dropped enough that the creek froze along its edges in the mornings, and the town pulled inward in the way of small communities facing the cold season, more suppers in, more gathering at the saloon's warming stove, less movement on the streets after dark. The cattle drive season was fully ended, and Dusty Creek returned to its residents, to the people who lived here rather than merely passed through. Vane Calloway had not been seen since his initial visit to Hawes' store. Peter kept track of the stage passenger lists and the hotel register and the reports from his one deputy, a young man named Sam Ferris who was more enthusiastic than experienced but reliably honest. Nothing came of it. Either Calloway had decided Ida in Dusty Creek was a less urgent problem than whatever was about to happen in Red Hollow, or he was waiting for something. Peter did not assume safety. But he loosened his vigilance slightly, because sustained vigilance without evidence was its own kind of trap, and he was too practical a man to let abstract anxiety substitute for actual threat assessment. What he did not do was loosen anything else. He had been honest with himself, alone in his office on a Sunday morning while the town was at church, about what was happening between himself and Ida Hawthorne. He was not a man given to self-deception, and the attempt to frame it as professional concern had not survived past the first 2 weeks. What he felt when she walked into the room was not professional. What he felt when she looked at him directly with those dark, careful eyes was not professional. What he felt on the evenings he did not sit beside her at supper, when he could see her from across the room and note the precise quality of her solitude as she worked through a meal with her characteristic dignified efficiency, was not professional. He had not told her any of this. It was too complicated. She was involved in an ongoing legal matter his office was party to. She was rebuilding her life in a town that had treated her badly and was only recently beginning to revise its behavior. The last thing she needed was a man complicating her circumstances with feelings that had no guarantee of being welcome. But Tuesday and Thursday came as they always did, and he sat beside her, as he always did, and the conversation between them had by November acquired the quality of a long-running correspondence, each session building naturally on what had come before, with references and callbacks, and a shorthand that develops between people who pay attention to each other. She had stopped looking at him with suspicion when he sat down. That was something. On the Thursday before Thanksgiving, which in 1882 was a federal holiday that Dusty Creek marked with a communal supper at the church hall rather than at Mrs. Prentice's dining room, Peter arrived at the usual time to find Ida already there, and the table beside her was not empty because one person had not yet sat down, but because she had quite deliberately placed her shawl on the chair beside her, which was, in the social language of dining rooms, a reservation. He registered this and sat down, and she removed her shawl without looking at him, and neither of them mentioned it, but the fact of it sat between them with a warmth that had nothing to do with Mrs. Prentice's stove. He had brought something. He produced it from the pocket of his coat, a small book, clearly used, the spine worn with reading. She took it from him and looked at the cover. It was a collection of essays by a woman named Harriet Martineau, a British writer and social theorist whose work Ida had encountered a reference to in her father's papers and had never been able to find an actual copy of. She looked up at him. "How did you know?" "You mentioned your father's papers," he said, "specifically that you had spent time reading everything he had, and that there was one name you kept encountering in references that you could never track down to a primary source." She had mentioned that once briefly on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago. "You wrote away for it," she said, understanding. "The bookseller in San Antonio had it," he said, which was not a denial. She held the book for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the weight of something chosen specifically for her, chosen because he had listened carefully enough to know what she would want. She had received gifts before in her life, practical gifts, necessary gifts. She had not received something that required this kind of attention. "Thank you," she said, and the words were insufficient, but the way she said them was not. "You're welcome," he said, and turned to his stew, and she opened the first page of the book and they sat beside each other in the Thursday evening of late November, not speaking, not needing to, each occupied with their own quiet and entirely at ease in the others. The Thanksgiving supper at the church hall 2 days later was the first communal social event Ida had attended since arriving in Dusty Creek. She went because Mrs. Aldrin asked her directly, and it would have been rude to refuse, and because she was less afraid of it than she would have been in October, and because she was honest enough with herself to know that part of the reason she was less afraid was that she knew Peter Graves would be there. He was there. He was also, as the town sheriff, present in an official capacity, greeting people, moving between tables, the particular social role of a lawman at a civic gathering that required him to be everywhere at once and nowhere in particular. She saw him across the hall several times, and their eyes met each time with the simple recognition of two people in the same room who are more aware of each other than of anyone else in it. After the meal, when the tables had been pushed back and the fiddle player had struck up something lively, and the hall was full of the particular warmth of people fed and together in the cold evening, Peter appeared beside her where she was standing near the wall, nominally watching the dancing but actually watching the social interactions of the room with the analytic attention she brought to everything. "Will you dance?" he said. She looked at him. "I don't know if that's wise," she said, which was honest. "It's a public event," he said. "People are dancing. I'm asking you to dance. I've been sitting beside you at supper twice a week for 2 months. I think the town has already drawn whatever conclusions it's going to draw." "That's one way of looking at it," she said. "Is there a better way?" she considered. "No," she said, and took the hand he offered. He danced with the particular focus he brought to everything, not showy, not performative, simply present and in time with the music. And she matched him, and it turned out that they danced well together, which surprised neither of them as much as it perhaps should have, because by now there was a pattern of fit between them in most things that had stopped surprising her and started feeling like something she would miss badly if it was gone. She would think about that later, that evening, in her room at the boarding house, with the Harriet Martineau collection open on the nightstand, and the cold November wind pushing at the window pane. She would think about what it meant to organize your thoughts around a person's absence and presence, what it meant to find a chair saved and feel something loosen in your chest, what it meant to have someone hand you a book and feel more genuinely seen than you had in longer than you could clearly remember. It meant something dangerous, she knew. It meant something she wanted, which was the most dangerous thing of all. The letter from Topeka arrived in the first week of December, addressed to Peter's office but relevant to both of them. Clement Walker's investigation had moved quickly, apparently because the evidence in the county tax archive had been considerably more incriminating than anyone anticipated, and because a second party had come forward independently. One of the ranchers cheated by Callaway, a man named Arlo Tippett, had kept detailed personal records of every transaction with the store for 3 years on his wife's insistence, and those records, compared against the official county tax filings, showed discrepancies so significant that the case had effectively built itself. Frank Callaway had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. Hector Mays had been suspended from his position pending the outcome of the inquiry. Criminal charges had been formally filed against both men, and a formal statement from the inquiry office noted, for the record, that one Ida Hawthorne, formerly of Red Hollow, Kansas, had been found to have no involvement whatsoever in the fire of March 1882 or in any financial irregularity at Callaway's General Store, and that the rumors suggesting otherwise were without foundation. Without foundation. Peter brought the letter to Hawes' store in person, which was perhaps the only time he had allowed himself an unmistakably personal gesture in his professional capacity, arriving at the store at mid-morning rather than waiting for Tuesday or Thursday supper, and placing the letter on the counter in front of Ida without preamble. She read it twice, without foundation. She set it down on the counter and put both hands flat beside it, and she looked at the surface of the wood grain beneath her palms, and the breath she drew was long and unsteady, and when she raised her eyes they were bright in a way that she controlled with visible effort. "It's done," Peter said, simply, without elaboration. "It's done," she repeated. "You should know," he said, "that Dusty Creek is going to hear about this. Walker's office is sending a public notice to the county record. It will be in the paper by Friday." "Good," she said, with a steadiness that had iron in it. "Good, let it be on the record." George Hawes, who had been pretending to arrange something in a supply crate while obviously listening to every word, straightened up and said, in a tone that was gruff with emotion he was not going to express more directly, "Well then, I'll want to discuss your wage, Ida. It's been insufficient." She almost laughed. It was not quite a laugh, but it was close enough that Peter noticed it, and the expression it put on his face was something he didn't bother to control, standing there in the December morning light falling through the store windows, the letter of exoneration on the counter between them, and Ida Hawthorne's eyes bright and her mouth curved in something that was not quite a smile but was on its way to becoming one. He said, without planning to, "Will you have supper with me tonight? Not at Mrs. Prentice's. I mean properly. There's a place in Harker's Junction, 12 miles out, that does a decent meal on weekday evenings. I have access to the county buggy." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's not sitting beside me at a shared supper," she said carefully. "No," he said, "it isn't." Another moment. "All right," she said. George Hawes, still apparently very busy with his supply crate, made a sound that might have been a cough. They drove to Harker's Junction in the county buggy in the December cold, with the stars enormous and close-looking above the flat plain and the horse's breath making small clouds in the dark air. They had never been in a small, private space together before, and the proximity was different from the dining room table, more immediate somehow, though neither of them moved to make it more so. They talked. They talked more freely than they had in the public dining room, where some portion of attention always went to managing the awareness of the room, and without that constraint, the conversation opened in ways that surprised them both. He told her about Missouri. about the year in St. Louis, and what it had been like to read law with no money and the particular humiliation of having to stop, not for lack of ability but for lack of funds, and how that humiliation had settled into him and become something else over time, not bitterness exactly, but a determination to pursue justice in the ways that were available to him rather than mourning the ways that weren't. She told him about her mother, about the last year of her mother's illness, and the particular weight of watching someone who had always been strong diminish, and the loneliness after, which was different from ordinary loneliness, because it was the loneliness of a person who had lost not just company but context, the person who had known her longest and best, the person whose knowledge of her was the foundation she had been standing on without quite knowing it until it was gone. He listened to this with the full, unperformed attention that was native to him, and when she finished he said, "Is that partly why Red Hollow mattered so much? Not just the injustice of it, but the fact that you had rebuilt something there, a place and a context, and it was destroyed." She sat with that for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly it." He nodded, not with the satisfied nod of a man who has been correct, but with the nod of someone receiving information and weighing it carefully. The supper in Harker's Junction was simple and good, a restaurant attached to the hotel there, run by a family that had no knowledge of or interest in Dusty Creek's social dynamics, which made it the most relaxed meal Ida had eaten in the better part of a year. They sat across from each other rather than side by side, and the face-to-face configuration was different again, more direct, more exposed, and she found that she did not mind the exposure the way she had thought she would. She had been afraid, she realized, for a long time, afraid of what another loss would do to her. Afraid that the self she had reconstructed after Red Hollow was too provisional, too fragile to sustain another blow, and that any investment in a place or a person was therefore a risk she could not afford. The fear was not irrational. The evidence of her life supported it. But she was looking across the table at Peter Graves, who had sat beside her when no one else would, who had written letters to protect her without being asked, who had found a book she had mentioned once and sent away for it, who had danced with her without performance and listened to her without agenda, and she thought that perhaps the fear, however reasonable, was the wrong thing to govern herself by. On the drive back through the cold night, with the plain stretching dark and enormous around them and the horse steady on the road, he said, "I should tell you something." She looked at him in the darkness. His profile was lit faintly by the stars, the clean line of jaw and brow that she had been looking at across supper tables for 2 months. "I've been careful," he said, "with what I said and how I said it, because of the legal matter and because I didn't want to complicate your situation before things were more settled. I want you to know that was the reason for the carefulness and not a lack of sincerity." She waited. "I have no professional reason for the suppers anymore," he said. "The legal matter is resolved. I should probably tell you that clearly, so you understand that anything that happens from here is entirely separate from my role as sheriff." "I understand that," she said. A pause. "Then I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to let this continue, whatever this is." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the cold air and the movement of the buggy and the enormous dark sky above the plain. "I'm not easy to know," she said. "It was not a warning exactly, it was simply the truth. I'm careful. I don't trust quickly and I don't let people in without good reason, and I have a habit of keeping myself contained that probably makes me seem colder than I am." "I know," he said. "I am also not easy to know. We're a difficult pair," she said. "Probably," he said. "I'm willing to try." She looked at the road ahead for a long moment and then she said, "So am I." Nothing dramatic happened in that moment. He did not take her hand, though the space between them on the buggy seat was small enough that he could have. She did not move closer. They simply drove on through the December night with the resolution between them like a quiet compact, and the stars above the plain were very bright, and Ida Hawthorne felt something that was not relief, not exactly, but was adjacent to it, a kind of rightness, the feeling of something arriving that had been in transit for a long time. December moved through its cold weeks and into the particular stillness that falls over the Texas plain at Christmas. Dusty Creek had a Christmas Eve gathering at the church, and Ida went. And this time she went not as someone braving a social event, but as someone who had a place in the room, who was greeted by name at the door, who found Mrs. Dillard and two of the other ranch wives making space for her, in a pew with a naturalness that might have been performative a month ago but now felt genuine, or close enough to genuine that the distinction didn't much matter. Peter was there, and they exchanged the look of two people who are aware of each other's presence across a room and are entirely comfortable with that awareness being visible. He walked her back to the boarding house after the service, the cold night sharp around them, their breath rising in white clouds, and at the door he said good night and held her gaze for a moment that was rich with everything they were still being careful about, and she went inside thinking that carefulness in this case was not the same thing as distance. January was where things changed. Vane Calloway came back to Dusty Creek. He arrived on the morning stage on a Tuesday, and Sam Ferris, Peter's deputy, spotted him at the hotel and came to the sheriff's office immediately. Peter had the description from his earlier inquiries and confirmed the identification from the hotel register, where Calloway had signed under the name Thomas Vane rather than bothering to reverse the order this time. Peter went to the hotel and knocked on the door of room 4. The man who opened it was in his early 40s, lean and dark-suited, with the deliberate calm of someone who did not feel threatened by an official call. He looked at Peter's badge and said, "Sheriff," without inflection. "Mr. Calloway," Peter said, "or do you prefer Vane? The register here says Thomas Vane, but I have correspondence suggesting you've used both." The man's expression did not change appreciably. "I go by Thomas," he said. "What brings you to Dusty Creek, Mr. Thomas?" "Personal business," the man said. "Personal business involving a woman named Ida Hawthorne," Peter said without making it a question. Something moved in the man's eyes very briefly. "I don't know anyone by that name." "You spoke with George Hawes about her in September," Peter said. "Hawes remembers the conversation clearly and is willing to say so to a judge." A pause. "I was making inquiries on behalf of a client." "That client being Frank Calloway," Peter said, "who is currently cooperating with a state revenue inquiry and is in no position to be sending people to harass witnesses." Another pause, longer this time. "I wasn't sent to harass anyone," the man said carefully. "I was contracted to find someone's location. That contract has since been canceled. I'm here on unrelated personal business." "Then you won't mind if I verify that," Peter said. "I'll be checking in with you daily while you're in town. If you approach Miss Hawthorne for any reason or anyone connected to her, I'll take that as a violation of the peace and act accordingly. I want that clearly understood." The man looked at him for a moment, and whatever assessment he was making evidently concluded that Peter was not a man making idle statements. He said understood, with the flat affect of a professional who had just revised his calculations. He left Dusty Creek on the Thursday stage. Peter told Ida about it that same Thursday evening at supper, and she listened with the controlled expression she had perfected in months of facing difficult news, and then she said, "You handled it." "Before you could worry about it unnecessarily," he said. She looked at him with an expression that was sharp and a little amused. "I see." "You had enough to worry about in September," he said. "The legal situation is resolved. I didn't see the point in adding a new anxiety. And if I'd rather know things even when they're unpleasant." "You do know," he said. Now, she considered this. "That's a fine distinction," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I'll work on it." The small almost argument dissolved as quickly as it had formed, which was its own form of intimacy, the ease of disagreement between people who trust each other enough not to need every moment to be smooth. February arrived with a warmth that the old-timers said was unusual for the season, and the whole town seemed to unclench slightly, walking in shirt-sleeves on the warmest afternoons, leaving windows open in the evenings for the first time since autumn. On a Friday afternoon in the middle of the month, Peter came to find Ida at the dry goods store and asked if she would like to walk with him to the creek. It was the first time he had asked her to go somewhere that had no practical purpose, no supper, no transportation, just walking, just being outside together in the warm late afternoon. And the simplicity of it was, paradoxically, the most explicitly romantic thing he had done. She took her coat from the hook and went with him. The creek at the edge of town was running clear and relatively high from the unusual warmth, and the pecan trees along its banks were beginning to show the earliest faint green of new growth. They walked along the bank without any particular destination, talking about small things, the new building going up on East Main, the account error she had found in Haw's February inventory, a letter he had received from his sister in Missouri who was expecting her first child. They stopped at a place where the bank widened and a fallen log made a natural seat, and they sat on it side by side in the afternoon light, and he said after a while, "I want to tell you something." She waited. She had learned that when he prefaced things this way, it was worth waiting for. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what's next. For you, I mean. The legal situation is settled. Your reputation here has recovered considerably. You have a good position with Hawes and a place at Mrs. Aldrin's, and you've built something real in this town, and I'm aware that you did all of that on your own without any help from anyone for most of it." "Not entirely on my own," she said. "Mostly," he said. "And I want you to know that I see that. What I'm going to say has nothing to do with any of that. What you've built here is yours regardless." She looked at him. "Peter." "I'm in love with you," he said, simply. With no dramatic framing, no build to it, just the plain facts stated in the same steady way he stated every plain fact, which somehow made it more overwhelming than any elaborate declaration would have been. "I have been for a while. I wanted to wait until everything else was settled to say it because I didn't want there to be any confusion about whether it was tangled up with the rest of it. It isn't. It's entirely separate. It's just true." The creek moved beside them. A bird called somewhere in the pecan trees. Ida sat with the words and felt them settle into her, felt the particular quality of something true arriving, something you recognize not because it's new, but because it matches something you've been carrying for a long time without a name for it. "I'm in love with you too," she said. It was easier to say than she'd expected, which was its own kind of revelation. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was not triumphant or relieved in the way she might have expected. It was simply present, simply open, simply there. He reached across the log and took her hand, and they sat by the creek in the February warmth, and the simplicity of it was nearly undone her. She leaned against his shoulder. He let her. Spring came to Dusty Creek with the particular extravagance of the Texas plain in bloom, and the town moved through its seasonal routines with Ida now fully a part of them, no longer the woman who sat alone, but a recognized member of the community, the woman who kept Hawes' accounts with exceptional precision, who attended church on Sundays, who could be seen on Friday afternoons walking along the creek with the sheriff, whose courtship was conducted with a public propriety that made it the kind of respectable town romance that people found both satisfying and somewhat romantic to observe. Mrs. Aldrin told Mrs. Prentice that she had seen it coming from the very first night. The widow Beale told anyone who would listen that she had always thought highly of Ida Hawthorne and was very pleased to see the young woman recognized properly. George Hawes raised Ida's wage without further discussion and hired a stock boy so she could focus on accounts full-time. Peter proposed in March, on a Sunday morning after church, on the same log by the creek where he had first told her he loved her. He produced a ring that had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that was, he said, the only thing of hers he had kept when she died. He held it out and he said without preamble, "I would like to marry you, if you'll have me." Ida looked at the ring in his palm and then at his face and then at the creek moving in the morning light and then back at him. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger. She kissed him, which was the first time, and he kissed her back, and the creek moved, and the pecan trees were green, and the morning was enormous and warm and entirely sufficient. They were married in May of 1882 in the Dusty Creek Church, with Mrs. Aldrin and George Hawes as witnesses, and a congregation that filled the pews to overflowing with people who had revised their opinions, and those who had held the right ones all along, and a few who attended purely for the social event, which was fine, because love does not require perfect motivation from its witnesses, only its participants. The Reverend Hollies, who was a man of moderate eloquence and good sense, kept the ceremony short and the vows simple, which suited them both entirely. Peter said the words with the quiet certainty he brought to all true statements, and Ida said them back with a precision that was its own form of depth, because she had learned to be careful about what she promised, and the fact that she promised this, completely and without qualification, was the most radical thing she had ever done. After the ceremony, Mrs. Prentice served a wedding supper in the church hall that the entire town attended, and for the first time since she had arrived in Dusty Creek, Ida did not sit alone. She sat beside her husband at the table of honor, and people came to them with food and good wishes and varying degrees of genuine warmth, and she accepted all of it with a grace she had been practicing for months. Peter, beside her, was attentive in the way he always was, noting things, making sure her plate was full and her glass refilled, and the well-wishers didn't press too long when she was visibly tired of conversation. All of this done so quietly and so naturally that she doubted anyone else noticed. She noticed. She would always notice. They moved into a house Peter had rented on the west end of town, a two-room place with a decent kitchen and a porch that faced the afternoon sun. It was not large, and it was not elaborate, but it was theirs, and that simple fact had a quality she had not let herself want for years, the particular rightness of a space that belongs to you and to someone else you have chosen and who has chosen you. She brought her 2 trunks, the Harriet Martineau collection and the other books she had accumulated, her father's papers, which she had kept through every displacement, and the small personal items that constituted the portable version of a life. He brought considerably less, because he had been living in spare rented rooms for years, but what he brought included a decent cast-iron stove and a bookshelf he had built himself from cedar, which he had made wide enough to hold considerably more books than he currently owned, which she understood as both a gift and a statement of intent. They built their life in Dusty Creek with the practical thoroughness of 2 people who had learned not to take foundation for granted. She kept her position at Hawes' store, because she had no interest in being an idle wife, and because the work genuinely satisfied her, and because Peter had never suggested otherwise. He kept his position as sheriff, and the town continued to value him in the way it had, though now there was an additional warmth in how people regarded him, the warmth people extend to a person who has become more legible to them, who has a household and a wife, and a place in the domestic social fabric of the community. Ida received a formal letter from Clement Walker's office in July, informing her that Frank Calloway had pled guilty to fraud and received a 3-year sentence, and that Hector Mays had received 5 years at the state penitentiary. The letter noted again that Miss Ida Hawthorne, now Mrs. Ida Graves, had been entirely exonerated of any wrongdoing and that the official record reflected this clearly. She read the letter at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning while Peter made coffee, and she set it down and looked out the window at the porch in the summer light, and she said, "It's done." He set a cup in front of her and sat across from her. "All of it," he said. "All of it," she agreed. She picked up the coffee and held it in both hands and looked at the letter and then at her husband and thought, with an almost vertiginous clarity, how different the world looked from the inside of a life that was actually hers, in a town that actually knew her, beside a person who actually saw her, compared to the inside of a rumor that had preceded her south through the territories and landed her, for 4 months, at a table alone. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. "I'm going to have a child," she said. The expression that moved across his face was something she filed away and kept. The open, unguarded quality of it, the uncomplicated, unhidden joy, which was not a thing he showed easily or often, and which was therefore all the more valuable for its rarity. He came around the table and took her hands in both of his, and he said very quietly, "When?" "January, I think," she said. "I've been counting weeks." "January," he repeated, as though placing the word carefully. "Are you pleased?" She said, which was a question she would not have asked in an earlier version of herself, the version that kept her own counsel and offered nothing vulnerable without sufficient armor. "Ida," he said, "there are no words adequate to what I am." She laughed. She laughed genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh she had nearly forgotten how to make in the months of sitting alone and being careful, and it filled the Sunday morning kitchen and went out the window into the summer air. And Peter Graves, who was not a man given to uncalculated gestures, pressed her hands to his lips and stayed there for a long moment. The autumn of 1882 moved into winter, and Ida moved with it, expanding and increasingly comfortable in a way that would have surprised the woman who had arrived in Dusty Creek in May of that year with $32, and a reputation that had been manufactured from lies and other people's fear. She was not the kind of woman to be made sentimental by pregnancy. She was the kind to be practical and slightly impatient with the physical limitations it imposed, but she was also honest enough to acknowledge, in the quiet of the evenings when Peter read beside her, and the house was warm and the wind outside was cold, that she had not been this close to contentment since her father was alive and she was still young enough to take home for granted. She did not take it for granted now. Mrs. Aldrin came to help in November, spending several afternoons teaching Ida the practical aspects of infant management that her education had thoroughly failed to cover, and Ida listened with the disciplined attention she brought to everything new, taking notes in the margin of a small notebook she kept beside her ledger. Peter watched this and said nothing, which was itself a form of eloquence. Their son was born on a bitter cold morning in late January of 1883, delivered by the town doctor, a competent and brisk man named Dr. Ellery, with Mrs. Aldrin assisting and Peter in the next room in a state of constrained anxiety that was, Mrs. Aldrin reported afterward, quite the most visible emotion anyone in Dusty Creek had ever seen from the sheriff. They named the boy James, for Ida's father. James Graves came into the world with a strong voice and a great deal of dark hair, and the immediately evident capacity for making every adult in the room feel that the world had been rearranged around him into a more important configuration. Peter held his son in the afternoon light of the January bedroom with an expression so unguarded that Ida, watching from the bed, felt her own heart catch on it. "Hello," Peter said to the baby, with the gravity he brought to important introductions. James made a sound of unspecific complaint. "That's fair," Peter said. Spring of 1883 brought Dusty Creek its usual renewal, the creek running high, the pecan trees greening, the cattle drives beginning their seasonal push northward through the territory. James Graves grew and changed with the speed that babies manage, each week distinct from the last, and Ida kept her work at Hawes' store, bringing the baby with her on mornings when Mrs. Aldrin was unavailable, and found that George Hawes, who was a confirmed bachelor with no children and a reputation for finding human emotion somewhat bewildering, was entirely defenseless against a 3-month-old and frequently found reasons to come out from behind the counter to make faces at James while Ida worked. Peter walked them home in the evenings. This became its own ritual, the early evening walk from Hawes' store to the house on the West End, with James in the fabric carrier that Mrs. Aldrin had sewn for the purpose and the long Texas sunsets unrolling above the roof lines, and conversation that moved through the events of the day and the town's news and the letters from Peter's sister in Missouri, who had had her own baby, a girl named Clara, 3 months after James was born, making the cousins close enough in age to be interesting to each other when they eventually met. They talked about going to Missouri one summer, when James was older, to visit. They talked about the future the way people do, when the future has become a place they trust, rather than a thing they dread. In the summer of 1883, the State Revenue Office in Topeka published a brief formal account of the Red Hollow fraud case in the Kansas State Register, a dry legal document that nevertheless contained, in its final paragraph, a clear statement of exoneration for Ida Graves, née Hawthorne, who had served as a key witness in the investigation. The Dusty Creek Gazette ran a short piece about it the following week, identifying Mrs. Graves as a resident of their own community. The widow Beale read the piece aloud at her Thursday afternoon tea, with considerable editorial additions about how she had never, not for one moment, believed otherwise. Ida read the piece at the breakfast table with James on her knee working very hard to eat his fist, and felt the clean satisfaction of a record corrected, of truth given its official form, of a dark chapter closed so completely that even its final shadow was gone. She handed the paper to Peter across the table. He read it. He folded it carefully and set it down. He looked at her. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. James, making a sound of enthusiastic commentary, moved on from his fist to the edge of the tablecloth. "No," Peter said to his son, redirecting the small, determined hand with the automatic reflexiveness of a person who had become, in 7 months, entirely fluent in the physical language of infant prevention. "He's stubborn," Ida observed. "He comes by it honestly," Peter said. She threw a dish rag at him, which he caught without looking up, which was the domestic equivalent of everything that had passed between them and everything that continued to. 2 years later, in the spring of 1885, their second child was born, a girl this time, whom they named Eleanor after Peter's mother, and who arrived into the world with the same excellent lungs as her brother and a significantly more placid temperament, a fact that James, now a confident toddler with strong opinions, seemed to regard with suspicion. The house on the West End had by this time been expanded, 2 rooms added with the help of Tom Dillard's ranch hands on a building weekend that Ida organized with the same precision she applied to everything, turning chaos into function in the time it took most people to find their tools. Peter was re-elected sheriff of Dusty Creek County in the spring of 1885, running unopposed, which was not surprising to anyone who had watched him work. The way he kept the peace without brutality, the way he was honest with a consistency that people could set their conduct by, the way he had made the jail a place for temporary consequences rather than forgotten people. He was, the town had come to understand, exactly the kind of man you wanted in that office, not for show, not for politics, but because when something was wrong, he would do what was right about it, regardless of the cost to himself. Ida had known that since September of 1882. She ran the accounts at Hawes' store until Eleanor was 18 months old and James was starting school, at which point she made a decision that she had been considering for some time. The town had grown enough that 2 dry goods stores were now operating, which was healthy for commerce but meant that Hawes' margin was tighter, and his need for full-time account management was diminishing. She spoke to him honestly about it, as she always had, and what emerged from that conversation was a new arrangement. She would maintain the books for Hawes on a part-time basis and take on additional account keeping for 3 other Dusty Creek businesses that had been managing their records poorly and expensively for lack of anyone with her skills. She built a practice. Not a firm, not yet, but the beginning of one. A woman who managed accounts for small businesses in a town that was growing, who had a reputation for precision and absolute honesty that preceded her now in the better way, the way of someone whose work was so reliable it had become the standard people compared against. Peter told her, one evening on the porch while Eleanor slept and James could be heard having an energetic conversation with himself in the next room, that he was proud of her. Not in the manner of a man acknowledging a wife's auxiliary accomplishment, but in the way of someone who genuinely admired what they were watching, the way he had always looked at her, with clear eyes and no performance. She told him she loved him, which she said with increasing ease these years on, the words having lost the terrifying weight they had carried when she first found them and become instead a warm, daily truth, like the house and the children and the porch in the evening, and all the other accumulated certainties of a life built on solid ground. He said it back. Alina made a sound from inside that suggested she was awake and had opinions. Ida went into her. Peter sat on the porch in the spring evening and listened to the sounds of his household, the voices of his wife and daughter and the ongoing narrative of his son, and felt the particular quality of a life that had arrived at something true, not perfect, not without its difficulties and its days of grinding ordinary frustration, but honest and sufficient and deeply, permanently worth the having. He thought about the night he had walked into Mrs. Prentice's dining room and pulled out the empty chair beside Ida Hawthorne, and how it had seemed at the time like a straightforward act of professional integrity, a sheriff correcting a local injustice, setting a record straight with his physical presence in a public room. He thought about how little he had understood in that moment what he was actually beginning. Inside the house, he could hear Ida talking to Alina in the low, clear voice she used with small people, calm and direct and infinitely patient, the same voice she used with everyone she trusted, stripped of the careful containment she had maintained for survival and open with the warmth that had always been underneath it. He had been the first to hear that voice, or one of the first, and he was aware of what it cost her to let it be heard, and what it meant that she let him hear it every day. James appeared in the doorway, looking out at his father with the dark eyes he had inherited from Ida and the stubborn set of jaw he had apparently developed independently. "Papa," he said, "I need to tell you something important." "Come out then," Peter said. James came out and stood on the porch with great seriousness. "There is a spider," he said, "in my room. It is large. It needs to go." "Spiders are useful," Peter said. "They eat insects." "I know," James said, "but it can be useful somewhere else." Peter stood, which was the correct response to a 3-year-old's logic at 7 o'clock in the evening, and followed his son inside. And the porch was empty in the spring night, and the stars above the Texas plain were the same stars that had been above the road to Harker's Junction on the first evening, and above the creek on the morning of the proposal, and above every ordinary and extraordinary night of a life that had begun, properly speaking, in a dining room in September of 1882. When the chair scraped back, and a man sat down beside a woman who had been sitting alone long enough. The spider, for the record, was persuaded out the window by means of a folded newspaper and returned to the exterior world without violence, which was the kind of resolution Peter Graves preferred whenever possible. Ida laughed from the next room when she heard it. It was a sound that filled the house and went out through the open window and dissolved into the warm spring evening, and the stars above Dusty Creek were bright and close-looking, and somewhere in the darkness the creek ran clear at the edge of town, and the pecan trees were green, and everything that had been broken was mended, and everything that had been lost was found, and the life they had made together was real and warm and entirely, permanently theirs.